The bag was sitting right there on the bench, unzipped, stuffed with cash, and nobody was looking. That was the part that stayed with Reed Calloway long after everything else faded. Not the money itself, not even what happened later. Just that moment of standing alone in the cold outside Maple Ridge Station, the January wind cutting through his jacket, and realizing that the world had just handed him a way out. He didn't take it. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. Reed was 38 years old and running on 4 hours of sleep when he found the bag. He'd been working a double at Brennan's Hardware on Dunbar Street, morning shift stocking shelves, afternoon shift covering the register when Pat called in sick again. And he'd taken the SkyTrain back to his apartment in East Vancouver because the truck was in the shop and had been for 3 weeks, because he couldn't afford the timing belt and the mechanic on Nanaimo kept leaving voicemails. He didn't have the heart to return. He had $42 in his checking account. He knew because he'd checked that morning, twice, like checking twice might change it. His daughter, Hazel, was 7 years old and had been coughing since November. Not a cold cough, the kind that goes away when the weather changes. The kind that the doctor at Renfrew Health called persistent bronchial inflammation and recommended a follow-up with a specialist. And the specialist had a 3-month wait list unless you went private. And going private cost money Reed didn't have and hadn't had in a long time. He wasn't thinking about any of that when he sat down on the bench. He was thinking about whether he'd remembered to leave enough milk for Hazel's breakfast, and whether his neighbor Mrs. Tran would hear her if she woke up before he got home. He was thinking about the fact that he hadn't eaten since noon and that the granola bar in his jacket pocket was his dinner. The bag was just there. Dark green canvas, zipper half open, wedged between the bench slat and the concrete wall like someone had set it down and gotten distracted. Reed almost didn't notice it. Then he did. He looked around. The platform was nearly empty. A teenager with headphones, an older man reading something on his phone, a woman in scrubs walking fast toward the exit. Nobody was turning back. Nobody was looking for anything. Reed reached over and pulled the zipper open the rest of the way. The bills were banded, 50s and 100s, stacked with the kind of care that suggested someone had counted them recently. He didn't count them himself. He couldn't, not there, but he could see there was a lot. More than he'd ever held in his life. Maybe more than he'd earned in the last 2 years combined. He sat with it for a long moment. Long enough that the teenager looked over and looked away again. Long enough that the train came and went, and he didn't get on it. He thought about Hazel's cough. He thought about the specialist. He thought about the timing belt, and the 3 weeks of voicemails, and the $42. Then, he picked up the bag, walked to the station booth, and told the transit worker behind the scratched glass that he'd found something. The woman at the booth, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked at him the way people look at someone doing something they don't quite believe. "You want to turn it in?" she said. Not a question. More like she was trying to confirm what she'd heard. "Yes," Reed said. She called the transit authority's lost and found coordinator. Reed waited on the bench, a different bench, near the exit, for 40 minutes while they sorted out the paperwork. A transit supervisor named Dan came and photographed the bag and the contents, and wrote down Reed's name and contact number, and told him the transit authority would attempt to locate the owner through the serial numbers on the bills, if there were any, and through any identifying materials in the bag. There was a business card at the bottom. Reed hadn't seen it. Dan found it, tucked under the last stack of bills. He didn't tell Reed whose card it was, just photographed it and put it in a sealed envelope. "If the money goes unclaimed for 90 days, Dan said, reading from something on his clipboard, "you may be eligible to file a finder's claim." "Okay," Reed said. "You don't want to know the amount?" Reed shook his head. He thought that knowing the exact number might make what he'd done feel different, like a loss instead of a decision. He took the SkyTrain home and found Hazel asleep on the couch with the TV still on, Mrs. Tran dozing in the armchair across the room with her reading glasses still on her face. He turned off the television, covered Hazel with the good blanket. The soft one she called her sky blanket, because it had clouds on it, and stood in the kitchen for a while, eating crackers over the sink, because that was what there was. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. The call came 9 days later, from a number he didn't recognize with a downtown Vancouver area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. The voice on the other end was a woman's, controlled, professional, the kind of voice that's learned to take up exactly as much space as it needs and no more. Is this Reed Calloway? Yes, my name is Sloane Whitfield. I believe you found something that belonged to me. There was a pause. Reed was standing in the hardware store's back room, holding a box of lag screws he'd been about to shelve. He set the box down. The bag, he said. The bag, she confirmed. I'd like to meet with you, if that's possible. To return something. You don't have to do that. Another pause. Longer this time. I know I don't have to, she said. That's not why I'm doing it. He looked her up after the call, because of course he did. Sloane Whitfield, 51 years old, founder and CEO of Whitfield Capital Partners, one of the more quietly influential private equity firms operating out of Vancouver. She was on the board of 3 nonprofits, had been profiled once in BNN Bloomberg and once in BC Business, and had given a TEDx talk about patient investment that had about 200,000 views. The photos showed a woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once in her life been unsure of where to stand in a room. She had not, as far as Reed could tell from 30 minutes of reading, ever lost a bag full of cash on the SkyTrain. But then, people didn't usually announce that in their media profiles. He texted Mrs. Tran and asked if she could stay with Hazel on Saturday morning. Mrs. Tran sent back a thumbs up and then a photo of the soup she was making, which was her way of saying yes. They met at a cafe on West Georgia, her choice, a quiet place with low lighting and tables far enough apart that you could have a private conversation. She was already there when he arrived, sitting with a coffee she hadn't touched, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than Reed's rent. She stood when she saw him, extended her hand. Her grip was firm, the kind that doesn't perform certainty, it just has it. Reed, she said, Messrs. Whitfield, Sloane. He sat, she sat. A server came and he ordered a coffee because he didn't know what else to do and he needed something to do with his hands. The money was for a property transaction, she said. A private deal. One of those situations where cash is just easier. I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound like anything, Reed said. It's not my business. I'd set it on the bench while I dealt with my phone. There was a message from my daughter's school and she stopped. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not much. Just a small adjustment, like a window coming slightly open. I was distracted, and when I got to the taxi, I realized. She reached into the bag beside her chair and placed an envelope on the table between them. Thick, sealed. I don't want that, Reed said immediately. I know you don't want it, she said. That's the whole point. He looked at the envelope. Didn't touch it. I have a daughter, he said finally. Not because it was relevant, but because he didn't know how else to explain. She's 7. She's got this cough that won't go away, and there's a specialist she needs to see. But the wait list is. He stopped. He hadn't meant to say any of that. I'm not telling you that to make a case. I just want you to understand that it wasn't easy, and I still didn't want to keep something that wasn't mine. Sloane looked at him for a long time without speaking. Her coffees were still untouched. What's her name? She said at last. Hazel. She nodded, like she was filing it somewhere. The envelope isn't a reward, she said. I don't believe in rewards for doing what's right. That's just reinforcing the idea that doing right requires an incentive. It's something else. What is it? An introduction, she said. Dr. Meena Suresh. She's the head of pediatric respiratory medicine at BC Children's Hospital. She's a friend. She'll see Hazel this week. Reed stared at her. The envelope, Sloane continued, has her card, a note from me, and a referral form already filled out. You just have to call the number and say your name. He didn't say anything for a moment. The coffee arrived and he wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking it. Why? He said. It was the only word that fit. Because. Sloane said, picking up her own coffee for the first time. I've spent 30 years in rooms with people who take what isn't theirs and call it strategy. and I'd like to do at least one thing this year that isn't that." He called Dr. Suresh on Monday. Her assistant was warm, efficient, and had clearly been expecting his call. They booked Hazel in for Thursday at 2 o'clock. He didn't tell Hazel where they were going. Just that they had an appointment, that it was important, and that she could choose where they went for lunch after. She chose the Vietnamese place on Kingsway, where the spring rolls came with the peanut sauce she liked. She was wearing her purple coat, and her hair was in 2 uneven braids, because Reed was still learning how to do braids, and wasn't good at making them match. They sat in the examination room while Dr. Suresh, a small woman with quick hands and an unhurried way of speaking, listened to Hazel's chest with a stethoscope that Hazel found deeply interesting. "Is that thing Bluetooth?" Hazel asked. Dr. Suresh laughed. "Acoustic," she said. "Old-fashioned? Like a record player?" "Exactly like a record player." Hazel decided, on the basis of this, that Dr. Suresh was trustworthy. The diagnosis was a mild form of reactive airway disease. Manageable, the doctor said. Very manageable, especially caught at this age. She prescribed an inhaler and a specific protocol for cold weather exposure, and told Reed that with consistent treatment, Hazel should see significant improvement within 6 to 8 weeks. She gave him her direct email. She said to reach out with questions. She said it like she meant it. In the car on the way to Kingsway, Hazel was quiet for a while, watching the rain streak sideways across the window. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, is everything going to be okay?" Reed kept his eyes on the road. His throat did something complicated. "Yeah, Hazel," he said. "I think it really is." He didn't hear from Sloan again for 3 weeks. He hadn't expected to. The transaction, if you could call it that, had felt complete. She'd done what she'd said she would do. He was grateful in a way that didn't know how to express it himself. Then one morning, he got a different kind of call. It was from a man named Ashford. No first name given, just Ashford, who said he was calling on behalf of Whitfield Capital Partners and wanted to know if Reed had any experience in facilities or property management. Reed said he'd been working hardware retail for 4 years, and before that he'd done site maintenance for a condo developer in Burnaby. Ashford asked if he'd be open to a conversation about a building operations role with their property portfolio. Reed said yes. The conversation turned into a formal interview. The interview turned into a second interview. The second interview turned into an offer, a real one, with a salary that made him reread it 3 times and benefits that included the kind of extended health coverage that had been a theoretical concept in his life for years. He didn't know if Sloan had arranged it. He suspected she had, or had at least made a call. He didn't know how to feel about that. There was a version of himself that wanted to refuse it on principle. It's the same stubborn, straight-backed version that had carried a bag of cash to a transit booth instead of taking the train home. But there was also Hazel. Hazel and her purple coat, and her uneven braids, and her inhaler sitting in the cup holder of the truck because the timing belt was finally fixed. Hazel, who had been coughing since November, and was coughing less now, noticeably less, and who had started asking if she could join the Saturday swimming class at the community center. He took the job. His first week at Whitfield Capital was disorienting in the specific way that arriving somewhere unfamiliar but not unwelcoming can be. The office was on the 14th floor of a building on Burrard, glass and clean lines, the kind of space that made Reed conscious of his shoes. He managed 2 commercial properties in the portfolio, routine maintenance, contractor coordination, tenant liaising, and it turned out that 4 years of hardware retail and a natural instinct for troubleshooting were more relevant than he'd thought. He ran into Sloan twice in the first week, both times briefly, both times in the hallway outside the boardroom. She nodded at him the way she would nod at any employee. He nodded back. He appreciated that. He wasn't sure what kind of story he wanted this to be, but he knew he didn't want it to be the kind where the rich woman condescends in the direction of gratitude. The third week, she stopped. "How's she?" Sloan asked. No preamble, no pretense that the question was about something else. "Better," Reed said. "A lot better, actually. The inhaler's working. She went swimming on Saturday." Something moved through Sloan's expression, not a smile, exactly, but the intention of one. "Good," she said. She started to turn away. Sloane's. She paused. Thank you, he said, not for the job. For Dr. Suresh. For doing that without making it into something. She was quiet for a moment. The hallway was empty around them. Just the distant sound of a phone ringing somewhere, and the hum of the building doing what buildings do. You know what I thought, she said. When Dan from Transit called and told me someone had turned in my bag. I thought there had been a mistake. I actually thought there must be some kind of administrative error. Because that's what 30 years does, I suppose. You stop expecting people to just be decent. She said the last two words like they were slightly foreign to her, like she was testing their weight. He was decent, Reed said simply. You were, she corrected. He didn't argue. He was learning slowly that some things don't need to be argued with. Spring came to Vancouver the way it always does, sideways and damp, and then, suddenly, as if someone had changed their mind, brilliant. The cherry blossoms came out on the street near Reed's apartment in early April, the pink-white kind that dropped petals on the windshield if you left the truck parked too long. Hazel collected them. She kept them in a small jar on her windowsill and called them the confetti. And this, for reasons Reed couldn't entirely articulate, was one of the things he thought about when he thought about the word luck. He and Sloane had started having lunch occasionally, not a planned thing. She'd asked him once if he wanted to debrief on an issue with a contractor at the Granville property, and they'd walked to a sandwich place around the corner. And then they'd done it again the following week without the excuse of the contractor. It was the kind of thing that could have been nothing. And for a while, Reed told himself it was nothing, because it was safer to tell yourself a thing is nothing until you're sure it isn't. She talked about her daughter Iris, who was 19 and studying environmental science at UBC, and who had, by Sloane's account, strong opinions about everything, and the patience to see most of them through. She talked about the company she'd built from a spare bedroom in a rented townhouse in Coquitlam when she was 32 and newly divorced, and people in suits kept explaining her own spreadsheets back to her. She talked about a cottage she owned in the Okanagan that she never had time to use and kept meaning to sell and hadn't been able to. Reed talked about Hazel. He talked about the hardware store and what it felt like to know every piece of equipment in a room before you'd been introduced to it. He talked about his father, who'd been a plumber in Calgary and had died when Reed was 26 from the kind of heart attack that announces itself with no warning. He talked, once, carefully, about Hazel's mother, who had left when Hazel was 2 and who sent birthday cards from somewhere in Nova Scotia, and how Hazel had asked, once, why they didn't have a mum like other kids at school, and he'd said because we have something better, and she'd said what? And he'd said us, and she'd thought about it and said okay. You raised her right, Sloane said. I'm still raising her, Reed said. I haven't gotten to the end to know how it turned out. That's parenthood, she said, with the first genuinely self-deprecating thing he'd ever heard her say, the night it shifted. And there was a night, a specific one, the way specific nights have a way of arriving without announcing themselves, was in late May. They'd stayed late in the office, dealing with a water damage issue at the Canby property, which had been a crisis that turned into a tedious series of phone calls that Reed navigated with the calm efficiency that had started to define his reputation in the office. By 7 o'clock, the crisis was contained and they were the last 2 people on the floor, the city doing its orange evening thing outside the big windows. Sloane made tea in the small kitchen near the boardroom. She brought Reed a cup without asking if he wanted one, which he noticed. They stood at the window. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. The day at the cafe. The envelope. He paused. You said you didn't believe in rewarding people for doing what's right, but you helped anyway, so what did you call it? She held her cup in both hands and looked out at the city. The light was doing something complicated with the glass towers. I called it, she said slowly, being the kind of a person I always meant to be, and kept deferring. Silence. The building hummed. I'm glad you deferred until now, Reed said. Specifically, she turned to look at him, and for the first time in all the months since a January platform and a green canvas bag, and a decision he almost hadn't known he was making. For the first time, she laughed. Not the controlled professional thing he'd occasionally heard in meetings. Something real and uncalculated and slightly surprised at itself, like she hadn't seen it coming either. That, she said, is either the most Canadian understatement I've ever heard, or a very smooth line. It's not a line, he said. I know, she said. That's why it works. Hazel met Sloane for the first time on a Saturday in June, at a park near the seawall, because Hazel had requested the presence of geese, and there were geese at the park near the seawall. Reed had explained only that she was someone from work, someone he knew, which was technically true. Hazel, who had her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn chin and her own completely original personality, assessed Sloane with the specific serious attention she gave to anything new, which was to look at it for a long time before deciding whether to trust it. Do you like geese? Hazel asked. I'm neutral on geese, Sloane said. Hazel considered this. That's honest, she said. Most adults pretend they like things. I've noticed that, Sloane agreed. Hazel spent 10 minutes throwing bread pieces to the geese and explaining the hierarchy of the flock to Sloane, who listened with complete and genuine attention and asked 2 follow-up questions that Hazel found satisfactory. By the end of the 10 minutes, something had been decided, in the way things get decided by 7-year-olds. Quietly and entirely, without ceremony or condition. Later, on the walk back to the truck, Hazel slipped her hand into Reed's and said, quietly, in the particular private register she used for things that mattered, Dad. She laughs like she means it. Reed looked across the path at Sloane, who was reading something on her phone and smiling at it. Something from Iris, probably. Something about geese or environmental policy or both. Yeah, he said, she does. There's a drawing taped to the refrigerator door in Reed's apartment. Hazel made it in late June with the good colored pencils she'd gotten for her birthday, and it shows 2 tall figures and 1 small one standing near what is identifiable. If you know Hazel's visual vocabulary, as the seawall. The water is blue-green. The sky has clouds that she drew carefully, their edges soft. Underneath the 3 figures she wrote, in the uneven block letters of a child who is still learning that letters have consistent sizes, the Goodones. Reed doesn't always notice it. It's just there, the way things you love are just there, present in the corner of your vision, part of the air of the place. But sometimes, early morning, when the light is coming in gray and soft through the kitchen window and the city hasn't decided yet what kind of day it's going to be, he stands in front of the refrigerator and looks at it for a moment. A bench on a cold January platform. A zipper half open. The whole long, ordinary weight of a life that was going wrong, and the one small decision that didn't. He hadn't done it for a reward. He hadn't done it to be noticed or to change anything. He'd done it because Hazel was asleep under her sky blanket at home, and she would grow up knowing what kind of person her father was, and that mattered to him more than anything the bag could have bought. The drawing stayed on the fridge. The confetti in the jar on the windowsill kept fading to a soft pale pink that Hazel said was even better than the bright, and the life, the ordinary particular quietly rebuilt life, kept going.